Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be covering politics in the early 19th century. And so our question is going to be, after the Congress of Vienna, various groups called for reforms within their respective countries. How was Great Britain's, that's England's, response to these pressures different from that of her continental neighbors? Okay, so grab a pen and paper and we'll get started. So, we're going to talk about this event called the Congress of Vienna, sometimes called the Concert of Europe, essentially the same thing. And this was a gigantic meeting that occurred in the city of Vienna. And so, Vienna was the capital of the Austrian Empire. Okay. And this event occurred in 1815. So, well, actually started in 1814 and went through 1815. And it was right after the defeat of Napoleon. Actually, Waterloo happened during it, so Napoleon came back briefly, you may remember. Well, anyways, this was a gigantic meeting, and the purpose was to get all of these delegates from all over Europe. All the countries, major countries of Europe were represented there. And the point is to figure out what to do after the defeat of Napoleon, after the end of the French Revolution. And you may remember that the French Revolution started in 1789 in France, and that Napoleon wasn't finally defeated at Waterloo till 1815. So that's 26 years of warfare. And it involved all of Europe. And so there was a lot to figure out, right? A lot of countries had been toppled by Napoleon, and a lot had happened. And so all these delegates got there, mostly representing the kings and queens of Europe who had been victorious. The old regimes seemed to be back in power, and it was kind of a glorious time in some ways for the Ancien regime. They had seemingly won. Now, one of the big issues that the delegates had to deal with was this new idea of popular sovereignty. Been right at the foundation of the French Revolution, and many Europeans had come to believe that a government wasn't legitimate unless the majority of the people were behind it. All right? And so many of these governments had been set up. Some of them were popularly elected. Some of them weren't. You remember Napoleon put his own relatives into power in some cases. And so the question became is, what about the kings and the queens who were sitting on those thrones? What about the nobles who had been removed? What about the church who had lost some of its property? What was going to happen? And for the new governments, or the old governments that were going to be put back into place, was popular sovereignty going to be something that was considered? In other words, maybe there was going to be a vote of some sort. And maybe some of the liberal gains of the revolution could be maintained. And so this was an issue. Another major issue was national self-determination. All right, so there were various peoples in Europe who were beginning to see themselves as unique nations. You may remember that we talked about this phenomenon, nationalism, in a previous lecture. People who share the same language and customs were beginning to think of themselves in terms of a nation. The Napoleonic Wars had awakened that to some degree. And for many of these nations, they were hoping that maybe the delegates at the Congress of Vienna would allow them some sort of right to national self-determination. That means that they would be recognized as independent countries, independent nations. All right. And so there were many places like Germany, for instance. There wasn't a Germany, there was Italian patriotism. In Italy, there wasn't an Italy. There was Polish patriotism. Poland had been swallowed up by some of her neighbors. All right. So what were the delegates going to do? Well, most of the delegates who represented the victorious European powers were conservative in nature. All right, so they were conservatives. They represented the ways of the ancien regime, the old regime. Those monarchs who had been swept out of power by the French Revolution. And so they settled upon the idea of restoration. Remember, conservatives believe in traditional forms of government. And so wherever possible, they tried to restore the old monarchs. The Bourbons were put back in power. All of the Bonapartes, not only in France, but all throughout Europe, were swept away. Any democratically elected government was swept away, and old kings and old borders, for the most part, were redrawn. All right? And for these conservative members, this was legitimacy, right? So, bring back the Bourbons in France, bring back the old monarchs. And in the case of France, they determined that they weren't gonna try to punish France. You know, some people thought that maybe it was okay to punish France, but ultimately they decided against this. One of the things they didn't want to do was antagonize the French. After all, they kind of wanted things to go back to the way they were, and they were wise enough to realize that if you provoke the French people, you might get another uprising. And so France got off fairly easily. Now, another big concern of the members of the Congress of Vienna, and something they ultimately decided upon, was trying to maintain some form of balance of power. All right. And this was a great concern. What they didn't want is they didn't want one nation to be too powerful. Experience had shown that when one nation was so much stronger than their neighbors, that nation tended to abuse its power. Traditionally, that nation had been France. Now, especially after the defeat of Napoleon, many feared that Russia was going to become the new disruptive power. And so what the members of the Congress of Vienna attempted to do was to create some sort of balance of power. And so certain countries, certain of the victorious powers, got beefed up. So Prussia, for instance, was beefed up so that it would be it would balance France out on France's eastern border and be able to stand up to Russia if Russia was now going to be the main troublemaker. And another idea was to create a confederation of Germans. Now, this wasn't going to be a nation, but it was going to be kind of like a league of some sort. It was going to be called the Germanic Confederation. And the nations, the states of Germany was, you'll remember, wasn't united yet, but they were going to act in concert together to try to prevent either France or Russia from gaining too much power. They would offset them to some degree. Another major concern of the victorious powers. And you'll remember a lot of countries had expended a lot of treasure and life trying to defeat the French and Napoleon. England had fought France for nearly 26 years, very little peace between the two. Russia had made huge sacrifices, Austria and Prussia. And these countries wanted to be rewarded for all the money and lives that they had lost. And so in the case of England, England was happy. England, as we know, was never really terribly interested in acquiring territory in continental Europe. England's interests were in its colonies, and so England was happy enough to pick up some new colonies. South Africa, which they had already inhabited from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. They took it over. And Sri Lanka and a couple of other places, England got some new overseas colonies, which was more than happy with. Russia, who had also made a major contribution, got more of Poland and also part of Finland. Okay. Austria picked up some new territories in northern Italy. And if you look on this map in blue, northern Italy touches Austria. So Austria was happy to pick up these wealthy northern Italian territories. And Prussia got quite a bit of territory, mostly in Germany. And that was partly to beef up Prussia, because it was perceived that Prussia was the weakest of the major powers. And so they wanted to beef her up. In addition to this, the victorious powers recognized that this was a really good thing to be meeting together rather than killing each other. As these victorious powers came together, they said we should do this more often. And so they agreed to something they called the Congress system. And the Congress system was basically a forerunner to the European Union, the United Nations, and various other bodies like this. Probably the UN would be a better example. It only involved European countries, but the thinking was that rather than resorting to war as their first instinct, they would resort to diplomacy instead. And so they agreed that they would meet, they would try to maintain the balance of power, they would try to settle crises before they blew up. Okay. And so that was essentially the main components of the Congress of Vienna. This is what they came up with. Restore the old monarchies, move around the borders to either maintain the balance of powers, beef up certain powers so that they're great powers, compensate those who had laid out sacrifices, and will agree to meet and try to prevent flare-ups before they happen again. All right. And I should mention that they did a pretty good job at this, because 1815, they stopped meeting. And there wasn't another major flare-up in Europe until 1914, which was World War I. So 99 years of peace, especially in Europe, is not such a bad track record. All right. However, there were some lingering national issues. All right. Not everybody was happy. Now, Germany had been left still divided. So Napoleon had cleaned Germany up. There had been hundreds of different states, but now there were 38. But 38 still wasn't one Germany that many of the Germans longed for. All right. Now, it's true there was this Germanic Confederation, which is in red here. You can see the outlines of it. And it encompassed some of the smaller German states, and Austria and Prussia. It was going to be under Austria's presidency. And they were going to act in concert together, so nobody, if one was attacked, all would be attacked, that sort of thing. But it fell short of what the German people wanted, German nationalists wanted. Um, Essentially, it was still 38 different uh, countries. There was no government. Um, Many of the German nationalists wanted some liberal reforms, maybe a constitution for the German people, and they got none of that. And so German nationalists were left dissatisfied. Another place that was a potential problem was the Balkans. The Balkans is this area of southeastern Europe. Part of it was under the domination of Turkey, which we haven't talked much about. Part of it was under the domination of Austria, but there were many, many little nations in there, people who were just beginning to awaken and who wanted some form of independence. And as far as nationalists in these countries were concerned, whether it was Austria or Turkey, they didn't want to be part of it. Other areas considered themselves to be occupied by foreign powers. And two of the major ones were Italy. Italy was divided into several small kingdoms. Most of the kingdoms, most of the major ones, were ruled by outsiders, particularly Austria. The only native Italian dynasty really worth anything was the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, which is in yellow there. But they were pretty small, and there was no united Italy. And so for Italian patriots, this was unacceptable. It was especially unacceptable to have Austria dominating the richest and the oldest and the most historical parts of Italy. Poland nationalists were also dissatisfied. Much of Poland was under Russian domination, or Prussian, part of it was under Prussia. So Polish patriots felt very dissatisfied. The delegates at Vienna hadn't taken their feelings into consideration at all, and just given it to Russia. So they were dissatisfied. Now, one area where nationalist issues were successfully resolved afterwards was in Latin America. So you may remember that Spain and Portugal were really weakened by the Napoleonic Wars. And so they had effectively lost control over their colonies in Latin America. Now, after the war, they wanted them back. However, Great Britain had moved in, and they had become valuable trading partners of the British and also of the Americans, the new United States. And so they were not keen on having Spain and Portugal institute mercantilism back in the Americas. And so with British and American support, many of these nations were able to keep their independence, and there were various nationalist movements in the Americas. And they broke free and got their independence. Okay. Well, so those were the big national issues. Now, after the Congress of Vienna, I want to look at how Eastern Europe navigated their course. Now, one country that had a lot to fear from nationalism was Austria. So this is a map of Austria here, and you can see how many different little nations are potentially in there. Okay? Now, nationalism was just starting to become a force, and as many of these nations started to awaken, they had the potential to cause a lot of problems. Particularly the Hungarians, they were really big, and they had traditionally had independence, but were now under Austria. And so the Austrians had a lot to be concerned with. And so they were very fearful of any sort of nationalist ideas, any idea of popular sovereignty, they were very fearful of. And so, under their chancellor, a famous diplomat by the name of Clemens von Metternich, a strong monarchy seemed like the only solution. In other words, you couldn't allow anybody to have any form of nationalist thinking. You needed to any sort of idea of popular sovereignty, and Metternich recognized that if any of these ideas, either liberal or nationalist, ever were allowed to flourish, then it would spell the doom of the Austrian Empire. And so under Metternich, Austria pursued a very conservative policy, all right, and did their best to try to squelch any sort of nationalist uprisings. Now, the German states were another solution. Now, remember, Austria is the president of the Germanic Confederation, and so the Napoleonic Wars and the period after produced uh, a lot of liberal movements. So many of the states there wanted to have greater freedom. Many of the people who lived in Germany, rather, wanted greater freedoms. They wanted constitutions for their individual states. And most of all, they wanted a united Germany. And these movements were particularly strong in the universities. So many students and their professors were very active in advocating for greater freedoms, these liberal ideas that had come with the French Revolution. They wanted more equality. They wanted the Germany to essentially become more like Britain in many ways. And most of all, they wanted this united Germany. From Metternich's perspective, and from many of the rulers of Germany, these little states who were conservative, they saw this as Jacobinism. Remember, the Jacobins were the radicals of the French Revolution. And Metternich realized that this was dangerous. These ideas could spread from one German state to another, and if they got into Austria, they could be very dangerous. And so in 1819, Metternich issued the Carlsbad Decrees. Carlsbad's a city, and this is where he issued them from. And they essentially set up a program of censorship of universities and the press, and there were very harsh penalties for advocating liberal ideas or nationalist ideas. Professors were threatened, students were threatened, newspapers were shut down, and Germany and Austria essentially became a police state. And so it became very clear that, at least from the rulers of Germany and Austria, that these ideas weren't welcome. And this was also the case in Russia. Now, Russia had never been invaded by the French. Remember, they had been successful in repulsing them. So it wasn't like in Austria and Germany where these ideas had seeped in through the French, but many of the Russians had been to France after the war. They had occupied France, and many of the officers had gotten a taste of Western life while serving in France. They had been exposed to these ideas, and many of them came back to Russia and saw how conservative and how backward, in their opinion, Russia was, and they wanted to bring these ideas. And they thought they saw their opportunity. In 1825, Russia got a new czar, and as he was being sworn in, some of these officers tried to stage a revolt. Unfortunately for them, though, this revolt was crushed in the month of December, and these revolutionaries became known as the Decembrists. That's what they were called. And um, this had the opposite effect of what they wanted, because the new czar, Nicholas, became very alarmed by this, not surprisingly, and it led him to become very repressive throughout his entire reign. And Russia also became a police state, and there was a lot of repression. Most of the people who had attempted this were either hung or they were sent out to Siberia and eventually died. And so Eastern Europe really clamped down as hard as they could on any sort of liberal and nationalist ideas. Just really use repression to the degree they could. Now, in France after the revolution, went back under the Bourbons. The Bourbons were the old family. Now, you remember Louis the 16th had been beheaded, and so at the time of his death, technically his son became Louis the 17th, although he never ruled. He was only a little boy, and he died in captivity during the revolution. And so his brother, who had escaped, he was one of the emigres, one of those people who had fled France, his brother became Louis the 18th. And with the defeat of Napoleon, Louis the 18th became the King of France. Now, naturally, the Bourbons were not big fans of liberalism or national ideas or radical ideas. They had seen what it had done to France. They blamed these ideas on the revolution and their family's troubles. But they saw it was impractical to go back, set the clock back. At least Louis the 18th did. Many of the other emigres wanted to try to bring everything back exactly the way it was, but couldn't completely set back. And so Louis the 18th did not believe in popular sovereignty. He was a big believer in divine rights. And he came up with a type of compromise. He gave the French a constitution, but he specified in the Constitution that it was because he felt like doing it. It wasn't because he had to do it. It wasn't because he needed the people, but he was doing it voluntarily. So it was kind of a half measure. He kept some of the reforms, equality before the law. So he didn't try to put the caste system back in, the estate system back in. He allowed religious liberty for the most part, though he favored the Catholic Church. And he kept the Napoleonic Code. France also had a bicameral legislature, that is a two-chamber parliament of sorts, except that this was going to be elected on a very narrow franchise. In other words, very, very, very small group of people were going to have the right to vote. Only 90,000 people out of 35 million, and these were the very wealthy, nobles, but also extremely wealthy bourgeoisie were allowed to be part of this, but very narrow. And so for most of the 1810s and into the 20s, this was the situation. In 1824, though, Louis died. He didn't have any kids, and so his brother, there was another brother, Charles, succeeded him in 1824, and Charles was a reactionary. In other words, he was determined, in fact, to try to set the clock back. And he did this gradually. One of the big things that he did was he tried to give reparations back to the emigres. So many of these people had lost their property in the during the course of the revolution. And this was a big issue. Should they get their property back? And ultimately, Charles wasn't willing to give them their property back. In other words, take it for the people that had it. But he wanted to remunerate them. He wanted to give them money from the state to give them, to compensate them. But this was very unpopular because obviously this was coming out of tax money. He also greatly increased the power of the Catholic Church, and this was very upsetting to many liberals and socialists who were believers at this point in separation of church and state. They saw this as kind of creeping, the old regime creeping back. He also restricted the press. He began to clamp down on some of the freedoms that his brother had allowed. And so things became pretty dicey for him. It became pretty unpopular. And even in this narrow parliament that France had, this narrow national assembly that it had, which was very conservative, even this assembly began to push back against him. And this led him to finally dissolve the chamber in 1830. Said, we're not going to do this anymore. And this led to a revolution. So this was too far. Liberals and radicals and students took to the streets. They made barricades in France in August of 1830, and Charles realized that he could no longer control the country. He'd lost control, and the people had risen up, and he fled the country, abdicating his power. And it became a bit of a question, who was going to take over? Was France going to become a republic again? Ultimately, though, his cousin, Louis Philippe, became the new monarch. It was called the July Monarchy. He was proclaimed the king. He was much more liberal. He was liked by the liberals. He had fought on the people's side during the revolution. And so for the middle class, he seemed like a better solution than the potential chaos of a republic. So remember, people were perhaps a little fearful that if you let the common people have too much power, that they might start doing things that were dangerous to the middle class. And so Louis Philippe seemed like a good solution to the middle class. And so he renounced some of the worst policies of his cousin. He renounced absolutism. He stripped the Catholic Church of some of its powers that it had gotten back. He repealed censorship. And so many of these things were very acceptable to liberals. This is what liberals had pretty much wanted. They didn't want the old regime back, but they didn't want any sort of popular democracy. And so the franchise was extended, the number of people were extended, but very, very minimally, from about 90,000 to 200,000, which in a country of 35 million is still very, very narrow. And so it was only really the upper middle class that had the right to vote still. And so sometimes we call Louis Philippe the bourgeois king because he identified with the interest of this extremely rich bourgeoisie type people. Unfortunately, though, this left the vast majority of Frenchmen completely out of power. Even though the lower classes and students and lower middle classes had been out in the streets, they were shut out of power, and so they were left seething with resentment. And Louis Philippe, from the very start, had this very narrow base. There wasn't a lot of popular support for him from the get-go, but through the 1830s and most of the 40s, he was able to govern. Now, the last place I want to look at is Great Britain. And Great Britain, of course, had a long tradition of some form of popular sovereignty. Even when everybody else was absolutist, Britain had it had its parliamentary system and its constitutional monarchy, which was in some ways the model um, for liberals around the country. Now, England had been for some time developing into a two-party system. Okay. And so in England in the early 19th century, the two parties were the Tories and the Whigs. Now, the Tories were the more conservative of the two parties. Their core constituency, their base, so to speak, was landed interest. They had the support of the Anglican Church. And so they represented old money, let's say. The Whigs were pretty conservative themselves, but they were slightly more liberally oriented. Their base was the mercantile interest, the merchants, the folks who had colonies and who traded, and uh, the manufacturing interest to some degrees. Now, Britain wasn't much better than France, though it was better. Whereas in France, 90,000 out of 35 million. I can't do the math in my head, but it was very small group of people who could vote. In Britain, it was 1 out of 15 men had the right to vote. So it was still essentially an upper middle class sort of thing. But it did have these two parties. All right. Now, one of the big issues in the early 19th century in Britain was how to account electorally for some of the changes. So let me explain to you. So in the United States now, every so often we take a census. Every 10 years we take a census, and that's because the population changes. So at one time, California was sparsely inhabited, right? If you went back 100 years ago, not many people lived in California. Now, of course, it's the largest state in the Union. And so we need to account for that. And so California gets to send more delegates to the House of Representatives, more representatives to the House of Representatives, rather. It gets more clout during presidential elections, right? I forget how many electoral votes California has. And so, it's important. We've recognized that when a place grows in population, if we're going to have anything like a democracy, the electoral power of that place needs to grow. But that wasn't the idea back in early 19th century Britain. True, it did have a parliament, but the parliament had the rules for electing parliament hadn't really changed since the 1400s. And so there were certain places that were population centers in 1400, but were now in the early 1900s, in the early 1800s, were now virtually uninhabited. People had moved away. It was just a cow pasture. And so the top picture there is of Old Sarum. Old Sarum was what was called a rotten borough. In other words, it sent delegates to Parliament, but nobody really lived there. And so there might have been like one nobleman who just basically had that particular, who had a seat in Congress guaranteed to him. He could put whoever he wanted there because he was the only person who could vote. And there were no other people who even lived there. Conversely, there were places like Manchester and Liverpool, which in 1400 didn't have anybody there, but had grown into great industrial centers, and they didn't have any votes. And so, particularly for industrialists, because these were industrial centers, Liverpool and Manchester, for factory owners, they said, well, we should have a right to vote. We should be able to send delegates to Parliament. It's not right that Old Sarum, which has nobody living in it, gets to, it's in the back pocket of a nobleman. And we have this place with hundreds of thousands of people in it that doesn't send anyone. It didn't seem right. And so the Great Reform Bill of 1830 was a Whig idea. Now remember, the Whigs were more liberal and they represented manufacturing interests, and so they wanted to have this bill passed. And naturally, the Tories did their best to stop it. And they essentially they were able to because they dominated the House of Lords. The House of Lords was one of the two, and the king wasn't too warm to the idea of switching up the electoral system. The king was conservative, the Tories were conservative, and it seemed like this was never going to happen. But what the Whigs did is they took their issue to the people. Now, this was something that really hadn't been done before. But the Whigs were smart enough to realize that if you could get the popular support for this, then you could at least make life very difficult for people who didn't want this done. And so they had mass demonstrations, and they were able to alarm the king enough that he was willing to go on board. But the Lords, the House of Lords, dominated by the Tories, still wasn't. And so, to make a long story short, the Whigs, with their popular support, were able to get the king to essentially force the Tories, force the Lords to accept this, and so the bill passed. And so some of these urban areas got their vote. The franchise, that is the number of people who could vote, was broadened from 1 in 15 to 1 in 4. And so, we wouldn't call this a democracy, but England was well on its way. I mean, 25% of men now had the right to vote. And so this included many, many middle-class people now had the right to vote. And what the Whigs had shown was that popular demonstrations could have a big effect. It wasn't possible anymore for even the king or even the lords to, maintain unpopular ideas in the face of mass demonstrations. And so the British kind of showed their own unique brand of conservatism. All right, even the conservative Tories recognized that you couldn't completely stop the clock, that you needed to change with the times. And from their perspective, it ultimately turned out to be a good thing, because rather than giving full-on democracy, had they waited and had a revolution or something like that, then you might have ended up with full-on democracy. And at least this way, by slowly changing, they were able to halt full-fledged democracy. Well, the immediate benefactors, of course, though, were the Whigs, because now that these urban areas could vote, now that the middle class was voting, they were in a very powerful position. And so they passed through many of these liberal ideas that they had wanted to get through for some time. Many liberals had come to recognize that slavery was evil by the 1830s. And so in 1833, slavery was abolished throughout the English Empire, throughout the British Empire. And so there would be no longer any slavery in the West Indies or really anywhere where Britain had an empire. They were also able to reform the criminal justice system. It was still very harsh. People were getting long sentences for relatively minor crimes, and many liberals had come to recognize that this was a bad thing. The biggest issue, though, that they tackled was something called the Corn Laws. All right. And the Corn Laws had been passed after the Napoleonic Wars. Now, I should mention that in England, in Europe for the most part, corn isn't what we think of corn in North America. What we would call corn, they would call maize. Corn in Europe and corn in Britain essentially means cereals: wheat, barley, rye. Those are all, and what we would call corn are all called corn. But we're here talking primarily about wheat. Well, anyways, as I mentioned, the Tories were the supporters of landed interest. In other words, individuals who had large farms. And many of these people saw the end of the Napoleonic Wars as bad for business. As long as Napoleon had been in power, the British could not buy grain, they could not buy corn from Europe because of the trade embargo. But now that the war was over, the fear is that the British would be able to buy corn from Prussia or Sweden or Eastern Europe, and that this would ruin many of these landed nobles. And so they'd put a tariff on the importation of grain. And the idea was this was going to keep it artificially high and make sure that people who farmed were going to be able to make a living, and that these great landlords would continue to be wealthy. However, by putting a tariff on something, if you've been following us, you know that this makes that thing more expensive. And so, for people who lived in cities, this was a really raw deal, right? You know, when they went to buy bread, basic staples, basic necessities, they were paying a lot more. Now, we know from earlier lectures that life in the big city during these days was miserable enough, and for many of these people, making eating more expensive seemed particularly cruel. Factory owners didn't like it either because it meant that they had to pay their workers higher wages, otherwise they were going to starve to death, and so it was cutting into their profits. And so for many of the for the Whigs and for many of the factory owners and even many of the people, the workers, the Corn Laws had to go. And again, the Whigs pulled a trick out of their old playbook. They went public again. They created the Anti-Corn Law League and went directly to the people. And so, with all this popular support, again, Britain had this and the Corn Laws repealed. And this was just the first of many liberal economic policies, right? So this was laissez-faire, which was popular among the liberals, was leave the government out of it. You know, let the market decide. If the Eastern Europeans can produce cheap grains, let's do it. Well, I don't want to give you the impression that the Whigs were the only ones who could play this game, because the Tories soon caught on. And they found areas that they could appeal to the people in too. So, being conservatives, the Tories felt that one of the tenets of conservatism is paternalism. True, they didn't believe in equality, but they did believe that, as upper class individuals, that they had a duty to the poor. And they learned to appeal to the public too. And they learned to stick it to the Whigs just as much as the Whigs had stuck it to them and to the industrialists. Now, one of the things that many Britons were beginning to realize was that it might not be such a good idea to have 9-year-olds working, 15-hour days underground in mines and in factories. And so in 1833, the Tories were able to get the Factory Act passed. Now, again, factory owners might not have liked that, but factory owners weren't really part of the base of the Tory party. They didn't really care. And so they were able to get some child labor laws passed, the first of their kind. They set minimum hours. They set minimum amount of schooling, and so these were the first of their kind. These sorts of things, and they were followed up by the Mine Act of 1842 that prohibited young children from going underground, had some protections for women. In 1850, they were able to get the Mine Inspection Act. And so they began to regulate some of this industry, which again wasn't particularly popular with factory owners or mining industrialists, but had general popular support. And so the Tories could do it just as well. Another major Tory accomplishment was creating the first Board of Health in 1848, and they were able to regulate some of the sanitary conditions in the cities, and had great success preventing cholera outbreaks. And so Britain did have a wider franchise. They had a greater amount of people who could vote by the 1840s. And their two-party system was able to appeal to the people, even those people who might not have the right to vote. And so hopefully we can see Britain was a bit different. Okay, so this is what I'd like you to do. After the Congress of Vienna, various groups called for reforms within their respective countries. How did Great Britain's response to these pressures, it should say, differ from that of her continental neighbors? Answer this question and in our discussion post, and I'll see you for our next lecture.